Welcome to The Golden Shadow, the podcast about psychology, philosophy, myth, mysticism, and mystery. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today we're talking about thinking versus feeling as a way of describing personality types. And this is actually a fairly complex and confusing topic, despite how prominent the terms thinking and feeling are in our daily vocabulary. And in case anyone listening hasn't figured this out, Alyssa and myself are not academics or licensed psychologists, so we're really just exploring the things that we find interesting. And we're going to do the best that we can with this topic and try and have some fun. Anyways, Alyssa, what do we mean by personality type or typology?
I think when we're referring to personality type or even typology, we start to get this sense of the Myers-Briggs, this way of classifying and identifying what certain people's propensity towards certain psychological types might be. So we have terms like ENFJ or INTP. We might have heard these in the general lexicon of our society. But it's good to sort of peel back those layers a bit and understand where those types come from. So typology refers to a Jungian model that really was born from a lot of clinical work and a lot of observation of how people seem to orient themselves to the world. What sort of functions of personality seem to be the strongest or ones that seem to be more weak in nature. And the model of typology was designed by Carl Jung as a way to really understand our habitual or preferential sort of psychological orientations to the world.
Right, so there's different aspects of the personality type that we're familiar with Myers-Briggs.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, I think most people, maybe not most people, but a lot of people our age, I think especially, have taken some kind of test online about your Myers-Briggs personality type, and that's introversion or extroversion, right? Sensing
versus
or
intuition,
and thinking and feeling, and then judging and
perception,
right? And we're going to focus today on thinking and feeling specifically, even though this is impossible to separate from the other aspects of personality.
Yes, they're very intertwined.
So especially introversion and extroversion interacts with thinking and feeling in a way that's important to understand.
Yes. In the Jungian model, you look at how one might have extroverted thinking or introverted feeling. And so the function itself never really exists in a vacuum by itself. There's always this other influence of how you are kind of orienting to the world. And are you extroverted in nature, kind of taking external factors in, pulling energy from outside, or is that coming from an internal factor through introversion?
So how might we define thinking?
Thinking, let's see, we can think about it as really a tendency to invest in a lot of mental resources, so concepts, theories, harmony between those dynamics, and really kind of focusing on what things simply are versus kind of what sentiments or personal dynamics might be attached to it. Thinking seeks to just understand what is.
Right, so there's an attempt at taking on a more objective perspective.
Yeah.
And objective in quotation marks, because that's a problematic word as far as the notion of being someone being absolutely objective is problematic.
Yeah.
Of course, but that the thinking faculty in some regard is an attempt to be more objective in some sense and try to establish the world as a place of facts and concepts and theories that might be coherent with each other, be coherent with your worldview. You're trying to make sense of reality in a way that's very fact-based. And you can see this obviously in everyone. There's not a person who's not thinking, right? It's always an aspect of personality that everyone is engaging in, but there are individuals who have a tendency to be more thinking than others. Yeah. And this is kind of what we tend to call types who are very rational, very intellectual types.
Yes.
that can be in positive ways or negative ways. We have a tendency to think of people sometimes as being overly intellectual or over rationalizing the world, sometimes rationalizing their own experience a little too much. But this is a concept we're familiar with.
Yeah.
Thinking is a little more straightforward than feeling.
Yeah, I would say of the two concepts, thinking kind of brings a lot of, sort of a connection that you immediately understand. And when we think of feeling, I think it's actually a little tricky because we're like, yeah, we know what feeling is. Like, I feel good. That thing makes me feel excited. We have a tendency to connect feeling with emotion.
Yeah.
But when we're looking at it in this way of a sort of psychological type or this orientation to the world, we actually seek to separate the emotional aspect from the feeling function.
Right.
So I think that they're often confused or sort of intertwined because emotion is much more accompanied by the feeling dynamic in a person, while the thinking individual might be actively suppressing it to some nature and not in a wholly negative way. But if one is really trying to understand the world through concepts or facts or objective orientation, sometimes the emotional dynamic gets in the way of that, and the thinking individual can kind of put that aside and really take in a lot of information using the thinking function without emotion getting in the way.
Right. Trying to, in some sense, override the feeling aspect of personality, of maybe suppressing feelings because they are in some sense interfering with your capacity to think.
Right. And with feeling, when we're looking at it as a psychological function, it's meant to hold the same sort of reasoning capability that the thinking function does. It just comes from a different source. So feeling is more of a function then that's prioritizing harmony of some sort of value-based dynamic in an individual, which could be influenced by social or environmental factors, could be personal morals, sentiments, certain subjective elements. It's a bit elusive in nature, honestly. It can be a little hard to understand. So I think we'll continue to explore it and kind of pull it apart.
Right. A lot of this is semantics.
Yeah.
Right. We're talking about the notion that we use the words thinking and feeling daily. We use them to describe a whole realm of mental actions using the same word to mean possibly 10 different things.
Yeah.
So the idea of emotions, someone will say like, oh, there's so many feelings, they're talking about emotions in some regard.
Yeah.
Or like, that feels good. Or, I don't like the way this sweater feels on me. Or, I don't know, this movie feels kind of weird.
Or you touch something that's hot, that feels hot, but that's not really, what the feeling function is based on. That's more of like a sensing thing where like our material existence has come into contact with something.
Right. So the semantics of these things are part of the challenge. Is figuring out what we really mean and what we're talking about. And the mind, of course, is the most complex thing in existence. And that's why semantics is such a challenge for the mind, because it's really hard to know what we're really talking about and how we can even separate things from each other, like separating thinking from feeling.
Yeah.
We're doing that, obviously, and it's useful to do so. But at the same time, you can't really separate thinking from feeling completely.
Yeah.
There's so much interweaving, so much we also just don't really understand about how the mind works.
Yeah,
and that's
definitely
important to keep in mind when we have these discussions about these concepts. But one way to think about it that might be useful is thinking is a tendency towards an objective perspective, in some sense, pushing towards being more objective. That doesn't necessarily mean being more correct, obviously.
Yeah.
Sometimes we assert objectivity when in fact we're not being more objective. We're just being more distant in some regard. And feeling more of a tendency towards a subjective perspective, prioritizing subjectivity in some sense. And again, these words are problematic. and they don't fit perfectly.
Yeah, they don't fit
we can't
perfect.
simply just say, well, objective, subjective, that's thinking, feeling.
Right.
It's like, that's tough.
Yeah, because part of the feeling function, especially as a rational function, is that it can often take objective things into account, and that's the motivating force. And that's where we start to get into some more of the sort of extroverted versus introverted influence. So an extroverted individual is more likely to take objective things into account. That's what it's basing a lot of its actions or behaviors off of. And so a good example of that, a feeling type person who's driven by extroverted tendencies might be in a room with other individuals looking at some art, and everyone's like, wow, it's so beautiful, and everyone's kind of going around saying their thoughts, and you as an individual might not actually really like this painting very much, but to kind of keep the cohesion, the social cohesion, to not like kind of disturb what's going on, you have that sense that you should, agree with it, and so you offer up, it is a beautiful painting, and that's a natural sort of extroverted feeling function that's trying to maintain a harmony amongst individuals, because maybe for you, morally or ethically, you want people to feel good. You want people to have a good time. You don't really want to throw things off, and that's coming from a factor that isn't so much really based on the your subjective opinion of what you thought was true, which was, the art wasn't that good, but it didn't really matter in this case.
Sure. So that's tapping into the introversion, extroversion sort of dynamic in some regard. Just to play off that sort of dynamic with the painting, that example, you could say someone who is more of a thinking type, if they were going to see a painting in a gallery, and maybe they're with a group of friends, and all their friends like the painting, the thinking type might not even experience feeling something from the painting.
Yeah.
In fact, they might look at the painting, look at the caption underneath the painting or the description, and say, oh, this was painted in 1850. And it's like, well, interesting. So that was like a time in England near the Victorian period where individuals were trying this kind of style of painting, and that's my way of relating to the painting is placing it into this timeline, and I'm judging it as being good or bad based on not how it makes me react on this sort of deep level, but on whether or not it's coherent with my worldview in some sense.
Yeah, in
like
a way
over-rationalizing the painting.
Yeah, in a way to even show some of like the dissonance might have been like, what if an example is the painting brought up certain aspects of like this, 1800s Victorian period, dynamic or influence, and yet they, in the painting itself, it's the artist has sort of decided to bring in some more like modern techniques or some sort of modern picture of something, and that sort of imbalance between the concepts might be the thinking, especially the extroverted thinking type, might not see that those things blend together in harmony. It's like, well, wasn't this supposed to be more of like a Victorian era inspired painting? Why are they bringing in this modern thing? That might even be what causes that dislike to happen in the thinking individual.
Sure. Someone could walk up to you and say, did you know this painting was painted on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro using Q-tips only? And that might be something that makes you think the painting is better in some way, or perhaps worse, even though the experience of the painting should not be changed. You look at it and you feel it, and perhaps some notion of what was needed to create the painting gives some sort of like rationalization of why it's good.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, well, it took so much work. Therefore it's good in some sense. And that's kind of this overriding a more visceral experience of the world with a notion of the theory behind the thing you're looking at, or it as a concept, or whether or not it's true. Let's say.
Yeah, I think the feeling function might bring in, as you said, more of like that visceral sort of I'm here and these are the people that are around me, or here are the things that are in my space, and what's this interconnected dynamic, and or what does that make me feel inside, or how is that connected to my own history, the things that I've gone through. It's kind of almost like diving into this deeper well of open experience. That's sort of opening up that realm of possibility where it's kind of moving from this more feeling-based place where the expansion that happens for the thinking individual becomes more abstract in nature. And that maybe there is kind of a less of an abstraction that's happening for the feeling individual in that case.
So a good way to illustrate this might be to discuss our own personality types, right?
Yeah.
In terms of thinking and feeling, because I'm a more thinking type. You're a more feeling type.
Yep.
That is somewhat typical
Yeah.
with male and female in some regard. But that allows us to come to this with our own experiences and maybe illustrate what it is we're talking about.
Yeah.
So being a thinking type, and in some sense a pretty extreme thinking type in some regards, there's clearly a way that I'm oriented towards the world and the way that I engage with my reality, which is in some sense default. It requires me to be mindful of what I'm doing in order to, in some sense, override how much I tend to think, to try and achieve more of a place of feeling, because feeling is not default for me in some sense. And the way that I approach any situation, any social situation, is often that I care very much about what's really going on in some sense, or what's true, or what's real.
Yeah.
In a way that I will prioritize what I think is happening over someone's feelings. And, this can lead to difficulties with relationships, for instance. Like I've had interpersonal conflict, relationship difficulties, let's say, in which what is happening, or what is fair, or what is true, and as far as the relationship goes, is more important to me than how the other person feels. And I will even say, your feelings are getting in the way of your connection with reality, or you're responding this in a way that is irrational,
Right.
and therefore you're not seeing the truth.
Yeah.
Or you think I never wash the dishes, but I do wash the dishes. In fact, I wash the dishes more than you because I keep track. I'm being very objective, very rational about this. And the person who's complaining about me not washing dishes enough, I might accuse them of being overly emotional, or overly not thinking this through clearly, not having a good grasp on reality.
Yeah.
And this is repeatedly how I interact with my reality.
Yeah.
I'm very systematic. I definitely have a tendency to try and engineer things.
Yes, the engineer.
Right. I like mapping things out. I like trying to make things coherent systematically, in terms of how the world works, perhaps, or even the things that we're discussing on this podcast, for instance. There's a tendency to not just want to go with my gut about what I think is true about these things. I want to do a lot of research. I want to map it out.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that my ideas of thinking and feeling fit well with my ideas about wisdom, or mindfulness, or rationality, irrationality, or intelligence, and my ideas about God, my ideas about spirituality, my ideas about religion. I want that all to fit, and I want it all to fit very nicely, because the truth is very important to me.
Yeah.
It's incredibly important to me. And that describes my experience as a thinking individual. And if we were going to have a discussion, let's say, where there's, this, and I think this is a common thing when people go to see a therapist, for instance, is the therapist might ask you, how do you feel about this conflict you might be having in your life? And my response might be, well, I think what makes sense is that this conflict is difficult, and I think that perhaps it's inconvenient, and that is why I'm finding myself more stressed out than usual. And they're not asking me that. They're asking,
Right.
how do you feel?
Right.
And I'm saying, well, I think that perhaps I need to change the way that I approach this conflict and maybe work on my self-awareness, maybe develop some strategies. And again, it's like they're not asking that.
Right.
I keep
the tendency
rationalizing what's happening.
for the thinking type is to intellectualize, even when prompted to get into the emotional feeling realm, because it's not what the easily accessible channel is. And so when asked that, I think there isn't even a conscious decision to not go to the emotional place. It's just, let me explain to you how I make sense of this then.
Yeah.
And it's through the intellectualization.
Right.
But I think for those who have that thinking type and might even struggle to get in touch and emotionally, you might ask yourself, how did I explain this to myself? How did I explain a situation? How did I make a sense of it?
Yeah.
And that might be an access point into understanding more of the emotional center that might be there sort of driving what's going on. Because, just because you're a thinking type doesn't mean you're devoid of emotion. And it's certainly good for a thinking type, especially if they are very high in that function, if that's something they move to a lot, to want to then, cultivate the other aspect.
Right.
As a feeling type, I wear my heart on my sleeve. And I think we always joke, my emotions are very easy to read. And that's because how I'm taking in the world has a lot to do with kind of understanding these interconnected dynamics between people. And I have a very strong extroverted feeling function, which means I'm making a lot of decisions and I'm choosing how to act in a situation based on what's good for the group, definitely, sometimes to the detriment of my own health or my own well-being. And I think that's where things can get a little pathological for me. I'm willing to sacrifice my own needs, my own desires, what I feel is right. I'll let that be compromised because there's this strong desire to want to maintain the status quo for other people. So I think if one has a strong extroverted feeling function, they might resonate a lot with being very empathic in nature, which is not only might you recognize the subtle feeling function in yourself, but you might recognize it in other people. And if you value keeping people feeling, happy or, letting things come in a way that doesn't throw off their dynamic too much, you are inherently then prioritizing their own needs over your own. So that feeling function for me is both a blessing and a curse, I would say, because I'm very, very high in the feeling function. It's one of my strongest typologies, and it's kind of like the driving force from everything else, and that can be very beneficial in helping me really understand situations with people in ways that I can read, into their values easily, into their emotional experiences, into their history. I can understand in a way that makes things feel very human and very real. I also have the ability to sort of go inside of myself and pull that out as well as I sort of move, I think, between the inward and outward focus quite readily. So for me, it's really about understanding, what is my desires for keeping this homeostasis around myself and around other people, and allowing my decisions and my behaviors to really be informed by a sense of, some sort of almost archaic, sort of primitive element of the pack, or even the inner dynamic to myself, to my external world. I think one thing that we talked about earlier was this idea of the feeling function tapping into some instinctual elements of the pack and the tribe.
Definitely deeper.
Yeah.
older.
Older, yeah.
If you want to think about it in evolutionary terms, it's something that is more natural and default to us, and the sort of thinking aspect of our personality is, in some sense, evolutionarily recent.
Yeah.
And that's why it's in some sense it feels kind of distant, impersonal.
Yeah.
Where you're almost placing yourself outside of yourself, or trying to, at least.
Yeah.
Strangely.
Yeah.
Abstraction, right? It's just
Right.
the pulling away from the core in some sense, and that's one way to think about this. I mean, again, it's problematic. And we need to be careful about how we talk about this. But the notion of feelings, in some sense, more instinctual, closer to your drives, less about suppressing, and more about just sort of being, letting the way that you naturally resonate with your environment kind of be more accessible to you. And a lot of thinking is, in some sense, trying to override that, to provide some sort of advantage for yourself. Problem solving.
Yeah.
And we as humans are really excellent problem solvers, specifically because we can interpret the world objectively in some regard. And that's what thinkers are doing, is they are becoming very good problem solvers. But they're doing so at the detriment of their more human qualities in some regard.
Yeah.
Sometimes. So it's the interplay between these two dynamics, again, is complex.
Yeah, and I don't think either one is more human than the other, but there's a sense of understanding the dynamic that's happening, and the sort of evolution of a human, where we see how maybe this thinking function has become this maybe more recent development that's opened up consciousness in a way that is expanding our capabilities as a species in ways that we were never, ever capable of before. And that certainly is quite powerful, and can be utilized to really expand our understanding of the world and ourself and our environment, that the maybe like inherent feeling function wouldn't have tapped into. So they're so interconnected in that way. They need each other really to survive.
Certainly. I do think there's something to be said for culturally. We've become increasingly thinking over time, because it is something that you can train, something that you can be conditioned into. And a lot of what school is aimed at, for instance, is cultivating the thinking function, understanding the world materialistically, understanding scientifically what is happening, the way things work, a notion of what is factually true, as opposed to a more kind of moral, what should be, or how should you live. And I think you can see this trend over time of conditioning and training that leads to greater and greater thinking prowess. And in some sense, that can be very powerful, and clearly has been very powerful in our progress technologically. But there is something lost in the suppression of feeling, in some sense, or not investing more time in cultivating a sort of fluency of feeling. And I think that's partially why people are spiritually starved in some regards right now.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about what life would be like if in school we valued the thinking function as much as the feeling function. So would we have more of these like group sort of dynamics where like students are being sort of allocated into times where they're learning to connect with each other, understand their environment better. It's like more like people skills and life skills,
definitely,
as well as like the cognitive intellectual skills, and how much more well-rounded and more balanced might we be if we were giving our children from a very young age the chance to operate in both spaces and cultivate strength on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and perhaps more opportunity to be weak or be vulnerable in some regard. I think just, you can talk about the subjects we teach. Like if we're teaching children physics and math in some sense, you are not really teaching them how to feel. You're teaching them how to think.
Right.
But beyond that, even more of the humanities classes is if you want to succeed in school, you need to sit down and be quiet. And you need to pay attention.
Right.
And there's not necessarily, there's not much feeling involved necessarily with sitting in class and being quiet and staring at a chalkboard for hours and hours. And children perhaps are not being given enough opportunity to play, scream, express themselves in some regard in all these ways that are not just necessarily verbal, but also just deeper and physical. And that is one aspect of our society that I think just over time has become more thinking in this way.
Yeah, and that might look like a higher prioritization for the arts and creative expression, which, certainly takes certain thinking functions into account, but allowing someone to really be in a space where they are, creating whether it's music or drawing or painting or what have you, kind of opening up a different channel where the thinking mind can sort of step aside and rest for a moment, and you can begin to just cultivate some other aspect of yourself that's maybe tapping into an emotional core and expressing that through art, or focusing on a dynamic from your life and expressing that through songwriting or whatnot, and allowing that to be just as important and just as cultivated as sitting in physics class and learning all the facts.
So there's a certain nature-nurture aspect to this whole notion of personality, right? So when we're talking about people's personality types, we are in some regard talking about nature.
Yes.
We're talking about the person that you were born as in some regard, or the person that you were meant to be, let's say. And when we encounter individuals throughout our journey in life, what we see is not necessarily their default personality or their true personality, as much as we're seeing that personality interacting with experiences.
Sure.
And sometimes it distorts the personality.
Yeah.
And someone who really should be an extroverted feeling type, for one reason or another, has been conditioned in some regard, or they've had maybe negative experiences, or maybe they've experienced trauma as a child.
Yes.
They've become more closed off, and they've become more in their head, and they've become averse to being vulnerable and expressing themselves. And so you get this personality type that's personality type that seems introverted and thinking, even though they might have been extroverted feeling in some regard. So this sort of distortion of self that can happen as a result of experience is important to understand in this regard, that just because someone who seems like a thinking type, they might not actually be really a thinking type.
Yes.
And we have to acknowledge this.
Yes, I think that's where some of the pushback comes from, actually creating tests and categorizing ourselves, and certainly wasn't really what the model of typology in the Jungian sense was meant for. It was really meant more to understand maybe who you are right now and what functions you're in touch with, and then why might that be, and how might going deeper into introspection help you see how inherent part of your nature has been distorted, as you said, due to some sort of aspect of your experience, and in turn then being able to reclaim some part of yourself that's been lost in this process, or maybe you never had access to it, but it would be really helpful for you to draw upon that thinking function to balance out the feeling. And so looking at that dynamic between the nature of someone, and truly kind of what the psychological functions offer us is just an expansion in understanding what's going on inside of us, our psychological orientations, the interpersonal dynamics, and why things play out the way that they do. So using it almost as a compass to orient ourselves in different situations.
Mm-hmm. So what's the shadow work that can be done in regards to thinking and feeling?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're just touching upon it really, which is once we begin to have an understanding of what's going on inside of our personality, we can ask why. If you have an incredibly strong feeling function and you're recognizing that seems to be a cause of pain or issue in your life, it could use some balance. And that might be because you have a tendency to, move towards taking care of others and maintaining that status quo, or you've learned to value other people's emotional states over yourself. And that reveals certainly something either about your childhood, your experiences, a natural inclination that you might have. And so the development then in the shadow work is to bring out this part of yourself that is allowing you to navigate those situations with better balance, which might mean drawing on the thinking function when you're feeling naturally inclined to sacrifice some part of yourself, because then the thinking function might play a role in allowing you to be more objective, to be more rational, to see things as they are, which is that you're hurting yourself, like you're not being rational here, and bringing that in, as uncomfortable as it might feel, can actually help you bring greater balance to your personality. So that shadow work really is about recognizing where you're at in the present moment, what you gravitate towards, and why other things might be in shadow. Why might your thinking or feeling function be in shadow? What experiences have affected that? And how can you cultivate greater balance?
And again, others, people people that care about you, working with some sort of professional is something that can be really helpful in this regard.
Yeah.
As with all shadow work, but
yeah.
you might not understand how much of a thinker you are without someone who cares about you to let you know and say, no, you have a tendency to kind of over rationalize what's happening, or you seem closed off, or you seem like a very cold person.
Yeah.
And we can always make advantage of trying to get some sort of external perspective, even from ourselves through journaling, or trying to really observe how we act with other people, and trying to externalize our personality in the form of taking notes about what happens to us.
It's the recognition and the reminder that these aspects that are in shadow, as we like to say, can be very unconscious, meaning we're just not aware of it. And that might not be because you don't want to. It's just you haven't really been given the opportunity to see it. So how can you engage in different activities that allows you to see yourself from these different perspectives? And certainly talking to other people who really know you can give you that honest feedback is very helpful. Or beginning that very honest, humbling, introspective work through journaling and inner questioning to really look at root dynamics of your personality.
Mm-hmm. Past experiences, perhaps.
Yeah.
As a child, things that you might have experienced that made you feel like you couldn't feel, perhaps.
Yeah, or couldn't fully express yourself, whether that was the thinking or feeling or possibly another function as well.
And the aim with this work would, in some sense, not to suppress thinking or feeling in any regard, or to flip-flop to the other side, but more to develop a kind of fluency in both.
Yes.
Where you know how to think when it's important, and you know how to feel when it's important, and to do so in healthy, virtuous ways.
Yes.
Almost like those tools are at your disposal in a way where you can access them when you need them.
Yes, exactly.
And now a question from our audience. Bink from Bay Farm in California has written in and would like us to talk about the magician archetype as seen in the tarot and in alchemy, perhaps.
The magician, this is thought of as consciousness really awakening in an individual and starting to understand the power to influence and shift your environment to gain access to the tools that are at your disposal, both internally and externally. If we relate it back to the Fool, which was 0, the magician is the number 1. So there's a step that's happened here.
Next step in the journey. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, the magician represents consciousness.
Yeah.
And the power that comes with consciousness.
Yeah.
In some regards, is you grow in some sense out of your adolescent stage.
Yeah.
And you begin to see the world in a bigger way.
From that instinctual stage, right? With the Fool, where
Yeah.
it's purely like an instinctual drive to move forward. And then suddenly, boom, consciousness awakens. And it's like, oh, okay, actually, I can do this more deliberately. I can do this in a way that kind of draws on certain strengths in myself or in my environment, or even sort of spiritually opening up those channels of inspiration and really being able to manipulate, as a magician might with a magic wand, kind of begin to wave around and cast a spell. And as if, things could just sort of transform to his will. You step into this role where you in turn really create and manifest and shift and shape things.
Right. So that alchemical power, in some sense, to convert a lump of coal into gold.
Right.
Let's say, to realize one's visions, to do the impossible in some sense. And there's this sense of agency that's gained, right?
Yeah.
As a step up from the Fool.
Yeah.
In some regards, where you've become a little bit more of a person. You've become a little bit more of an individual.
Yes.
Right? We're talking about the individuation process in some regard. And if we think about it in terms of the hero's journey, if last episode we talked about the Fool as being the nascent initial stage of the journey, when the Fool is still in the sheltered existence and perhaps is decided to take that step outward into the world, into the chaos, into the place of good and evil. The magician represents the hero on the path now. Yeah. And maybe has acquired some tools or has acquired some friends or has a mentor or something like that early in the journey. Yeah. Before the major fall, let's say, before the abyss. Yeah. So a lot of the popular stories we know, perhaps Luke Skywalker has received the lightsaber and he has met Obi-Wan and he has C-3PO and R2-D2 and he's traveling now in his speeder and he's not really the Fool anymore. He's on the journey now and he's learning about the Force. He's becoming more aware, more conscious. He has a life on Tatooine, and that's all he knows. And then his aunt and uncle are murdered, and there's stormtroopers, and there's the rebellion, and there's a princess, and all of a sudden he's like, his mind is expanding very rapidly. Yeah. And that's, in some sense, the magician can kind of represent this stage of potential somewhat being realized. And as the potential is realized, the world opens up to you. And there's a path you can take in which you can really convert something into something that was just an idea into reality. Yeah. That's where that sense of that like transmutation starts to happen, where you are starting with some sort of source material or idea, and through sort of conscious will or the realization of what is actually possible and what you can do about it, that starts to actually take hold and take shape. And so the magician is really about stepping into that sense of sort of like a burgeoning power that's just beginning to bubble up to the surface, and really thinking about
where the tools are and how you might access them. And are there more subtle tools? And are there people who can give you new ones? And what are the ones in your environment that you can take hold of? So really an opening up of the realm of possibility that the Fool started, so that the hero can actually, get through the journey and not just sort of walk through it sort of blinded the whole time.
Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. These podcasts are only possible with the support of viewers like you.